Hi YouTube. This is going to be a video response to a video that was uploaded about a week ago by EnigmaHood, where he gave his reaction to the Ferguson grand jury trial verdict on the shooting death of Michael Brown by Officer Darren Wilson. And I just wanted to say before I begin and start into EnigmaHood's video, this is meant to be a video response. I sort of want to reach out to him because I feel like that's probably the correct approach here. So this isn't meant to be necessarily a, debunking video or anything like that. I really would like to reach out and sort of appeal to EnigmaHood to come to rationality, because when I watched his video initially, I wondered why I'm even subscribed to him. I mean, the video came up in my feed. I haven't watched that many of his videos recently, although I should say I haven't watched a lot of YouTube videos from my subscription feed in the last 6 months or so anyway. But I couldn't quite remember why I was even subscribed to him, because the video seemed to me to be quite irrational. And I thought, why would I be subscribed to this person? And I went back through his catalog and I found that he had actually done some videos on presuppositional apologetics, and I thought, okay, that's our common thread. That's what we have in common, is this desire, I think, to have rationality and correct argumentation when dealing with matters of reason and logic and things like that. And that's why I was subscribed, and that's really why I felt compelled to make this video, because I think there's some areas here where EnigmaHood could sort of come to reason, and I think these issues are sensitive enough that it's important to be very careful when dealing with issues of race and gender, to make sure that you're not, that you're not igniting more fires than are already there. So let's have a listen to what EnigmaHood's reaction was to the grand jury trial verdict.
I am outraged, but I'm not surprised. This is what I've always said. If you do not satisfy people's need for vengeance, people will get angry, and that will lead to vigilantism and rioting. And that's exactly what happened.
Okay, so first of all, there's a key point to be made here. Is if you don't satisfy the people's need for justice, whatever that is, they'll resort to vigilantism. Well, an incredibly small minority might do that. The vast majority of people do not do that. And I think in a country where we subscribe to the rule of law, most people are against that idea, against the idea of vigilantism. I mean, that's sort of what the rule of law is about, right? So let's continue.
The reason for why we punish criminals isn't to rehabilitate them, like so many Americans like to believe. It's about satisfying the public's need for vengeance. It's not about satisfying the victim's need for vengeance.
Okay, I'm not sure where he gets this from. That's not the premise behind the rule of law, is that, we're just going to satisfy people's bloodlust here, otherwise they'll go crazy. So we're going to, and of course, what this says is we're more concerned, the undertone to this is that people are just more concerned to see something happen or they'll go crazy, right? That their need for vengeance. And I'm not sure why unrelated people, he actually says, it's not about satisfying the victim's need for vengeance, it's the public's need for vengeance. Well, in most of these cases, we all feel some tug at our heartstrings when we hear about someone that we don't know being harmed. It's still not, we have no direct connection to that. We have no direct ties to that. So it seems odd to me that we would punish people to satisfy a whole bunch of unrelated people and with no care for the victim, right? I don't think that's what we do. I think there is, of course, some sentiment there that we would like to rehabilitate people if possible. I think we all agree upon that. Because most of us understand as well that crime and criminality tends to stem from dysfunction. And so while these are perpetrators and they are the guilty parties, they're also the recipients of usually some unfortunate life events and that sort of things that lead them there. So of course we would like to rehabilitate them, but more importantly, crime and punishment is really about protecting the public at large, removing people from society if they are proven that they can't get along well with others and they do things to harm one another, and try to make their prison term reasonable enough that we can assume that they'll not reoffend. And if they do, well, of course, then they're put back in. And if the crime is serious enough and we feel that they cannot be trusted with the rest of the public, then we remove them completely, indefinitely. And I think that's what it's about.
The government is not afraid of criminals. It's not afraid of the victims. It is afraid of the people.
Well, of course, in the case of criminality, I wouldn't expect the government to be afraid of the criminals. And I would hope that the government is afraid of the people. I mean, to me, that's the way it should be. The government should always be fearful of the people. There's no need for the government to be fearful of the victims, other than maybe being challenged legally for failure to act in a reasonable fashion to protect. But the government, of course, should not be fearful of the criminals. That wouldn't be a good thing.
They militarize not because of criminals. That only happens in the movies, right? In like Predator 2 and stuff like that, when they become militarized because of crime. That's fictional. In real life, they only militarize because the people rise up.
Well, again, the people don't rise up. Small groups of people, incredibly small groups of people, with regards to the totality of the population, right? And so, yes, the police sort of militarize in those cases, but it's not for the reasons it's not because they're afraid of the people. It's because they're tasked with protecting life, liberty, and property of not only the citizenry at large, but of the people themselves, the people that are rising up and protesting, right? They're tasked with their safety and protection as well. And to somehow say that the police don't militarize against criminals and that's indicative somehow of the fact that they're afraid of the people and not afraid of criminals is completely missing the mark, because of course criminals never rise up in a mass like that. You don't sort of have 2,000 criminals that gather together in some sort of a flash mob and march to a city. You can bet your bottom dollar that the police would militarize if that were the case. Of course, criminals are far more disparate elements, right? And they operate more covertly, so the police have to do stings and stakeouts and investigations and obtain surveillance camera footage and phone records and all kinds of different things in order to catch criminals. But it's got nothing to do, this not militarizing against the criminals has got nothing to do with what sort of EnigmaHood is indicating here.
And they rise up because they perceive corruption or discrimination.
Well, and that's true, and of course that's a hallmark of any healthy democracy. This is I think what in some ways makes the West great, is that they're able to do that, and they're able to speak. And many of the great societal changes have been brought about by people demonstrating that should be differentiated, however, from the riots and the damaging protests, I think.
Why didn't the prosecutor indict this Darren Wilson fucker? Why did he hand it over to a grand jury? The prosecutor could have just indicted him. That was his choice. It's because he's corrupt. He's biased. He's biased against black people. His father was killed by a black person.
All right. Well, I don't really know exactly why he didn't choose to indict and why he handed off to a grand jury. I only know what I've heard. And what I've heard is that there was an attempt here. There was a desire to avoid any insinuations that he might be acting in a biased fashion. And this is why he made the grand jury all the evidence and everything available after the fact, right? He tried to be as transparent as possible about it. I think he took it out of his hands by sending it to a grand jury so that he could avoid any accusations of racism and impropriety here. And that's why he chose to make it all public. And the thing is, what bothers me the most here is EnigmaHood has made the mention here that his father was killed by a black person, and so therefore he's racist. And unless you've got something else there, I mean, you need more than that, than the fact that his father was killed by a black person to declare him a racist. Otherwise, that's racist, right? You're making an assumption here that he doesn't like black people, or that he would choose not to acquit a white guy who killed a black person solely based on the fact that white and black, race, because of what happened to his father. And you just don't know that, or if you do, I think the onus is on you to provide far more evidence than just making the case that his dad was killed by a black guy.
Do you really want a person like that as a prosecutor?
Well, that all depends. That all depends on his level of proficiency, right? And his track record. I mean, is he a good prosecutor or isn't he? If you can prove racism exists with him, then no, I wouldn't want the guy as a prosecutor. I don't think that that's been proven here. And so, I would say it depends on the content of his character and his level of proficiency. Shouldn't that be what it's about?
Someone who's supposed to fight on behalf of a black person who was killed by a white cop?
Well, yes, I would agree that he should be there to fight for the rights of anybody who's suffered an injustice at the hands of anyone else. But of course, that necessitates that an injustice was actually done. And really, that's what we're talking about here, right? We're trying to assess whether or not an injustice has been enacted here.
He intentionally sabotaged it.
Yeah, you don't know that. He could have also chosen just not to indict. He didn't have to send it to a grand jury. He didn't have to have any kind of a transparency either. I think that would have been more indicative of sabotaging something.
He didn't want to do this case. He wanted to dust his hands off and hand it off to the grand jury, who he knew weren't going to indict him.
Well, he either wanted to sabotage it or he wanted to not have anything to do. He wanted to dust his hands of it, right? I mean, one or the other. To say that he knew that the grand jury wasn't going to indict him, there's only probably one real way he could have known that, and that is if the preponderance of the evidence would lead them to that conclusion, right? There's the old joke about grand jury, will indict a ham sandwich. I mean, their indictment record is incredibly high. I don't know if you know that or not. It's incredibly high. And so the only way they would probably not choose to indict the officer, especially in, racially charged atmosphere, would be if the evidence was so overwhelming that they knew that there's no way, and it would be a waste of taxpayer money and everyone's time to actually indict.
He's a piece of shit racist that's in a position of authority, just like the Ferguson police force.
Well, I understand you may not like the guy. I'm not sure why, but we're going to need more if we're going to have charges of racism brought against him, right? It's not enough to say that his dad was killed by a black guy. We're going to need more than that before you can make the accusation that he's a racist and therefore this is the chain of events that took place.
It's so bizarre when you see these communities that have a certain racial makeup, like in Ferguson, where they're all black, and then you can have other communities, which are like Chinese communities, Indian communities, Hispanic communities. But over and over again, what we see is the police force is made up of white people, and so are the government authorities. The power structure is still white, whereas the neighborhood makeup is a completely different ethnicity. Why is that?
Well, that's a good question. Why is that? I think it's important. I mean, first of all, why does it matter? If race doesn't matter, then why does it matter, right? I think you have to remember, too, that in those communities, when you talk about the government structure, that's the voting bloc. So the white people are in power because all of those minority groups are putting them in power. Now, if you're going to ask the question, why is it that there aren't as many people, maybe they're not making it into those positions because there's not enough of them even applying, well, that's a different question. And I think that's a valid question, of course. I think it's a reasonable question. The problem I have here is because of the overtone of this entire video, what I hear, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm happy to be corrected. What I hear is the insinuation here that it's because of racism, that the power structure is predominantly white and the police forces are predominantly white, because of some sort of a racism. And I would say, and anyone out there can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty certain that there are many police precincts in the U.S. in different places that have, these different racial makeups of the population that have a high percentage of Black and Hispanic police officers. This is certainly something I've heard with regards to the chokehold incident, that those precincts are actually quite highly representative of the Black community.
So this is what people are angry about. They don't want to be controlled by a bunch of racists.
Okay, here's where I really got to call on you, EnigmaHood, to come to reason. Because first of all, that statement is racist. You've just demonized an entire race of people to say that the power structure is predominantly white, the cops are predominantly white, and they're racists. And that's what people are mad about. They don't want to be controlled by a bunch of racists. Now, I'm not the best guy to be extolling the virtues of the state because I'm actually kind of a armchair anarchist. But the whole point is not that the citizenry should be controlled by their government, not in a representative democracy or a republic. As I said earlier, the government should actually be fearful of the people, and the people should have nothing to fear from the government unless they are actually acting in a way that goes against the government, which essentially is an extension of the rest of their peers, all the rest of the population, right? And so in the ideal world, that's the way it should be. So it's not that they're being controlled by anybody unless they choose to act in a way that's harmful to their fellow citizens. But to say that the power structure is white and the cops are predominantly white, therefore racists, is an incredibly racist statement. And I think actually you should make a retraction video, because there are a lot of people who dedicate their lives to trying to help not only police officers, but other even politicians. I'm not a big fan of the Republican Party or anything like that, but I watched an episode of the O'Reilly Factor last night where Mike Huckabee was talking about the time when he was Arkansas governor and all of the things that he did to try to help minorities. And he was actually, it was interesting. This was a good insight for me. I think he's a decent person. I don't think he's a bad guy, right? I'm not a big fan of politicians to begin with. But he was talking about how when he was the governor, he saw a lot of minorities with longer prison terms for the similar crimes that some other people might have. And so he spent a lot of time commuting sentences. He would go over them and over them and over them. He commuted thousands of sentences while he was during his term. And the reason he said it wasn't race. That's what the race baiters would sort of like to think, would like to point to. But he said, if you actually did a cross section of it, what it turned out to be was the people that in the lower incomes. And of course, the minorities tend to be in the lower incomes. And so people with lower incomes they don't have the same access to representation and good quality representation and things like that. So they would tend to get prosecuted more often, and they would tend to have longer sentences. And so he was doing his part to try to even things out, to try to say, listen, if this person had access to better representation, here's a comparative crime, committed by someone of higher economic means. Let's commute his sentence to what it really to reflect what it kind of should be. So I think the reasonable thing to do would be to make a follow-up video to this video and retract a little bit on the statements of racism, because I don't think race baiting helps in this current climate, not one bit.
They don't want to be controlled by a police force that's composed primarily of white people. Why are they all white?
Well, again, there's reasons for that, and I think that's a good question, and that's a good thing to ask. But again, you're insinuating that white people are racist, and that's a racist statement.
What, you have to be white to be on the police force? Why?
No, of course you don't. Have you not heard of affirmative action? You don't have to be white to be on the police force. I'm sure there are many police forces that would love to improve their public image by having far more minorities apply for and be competent enough to become police officers. I think it's irresponsible to just sort of say, only white people are qualified to be on the police force. This is counter to the facts on the ground. And again, this all is still with the undertone that white people are racist. So it's not a good idea to have so many white people on a police force in areas where there are minorities. Now, it might be better to have more minorities on the police force in those areas to make the citizenry there feel more comfortable. But, you know, this is sort of and I'm not going to use the term reverse racism because that's a bogus term. It is a racist thing to say because this is the inverse. If a white person says, you know, they don't feel comfortable because there's a black guy following them down the street, then everybody comes unglued, right? That's racist. But it's not racist to say that black people in the neighborhood feel uncomfortable because there's a white police patrolling the neighborhood. And I'm not saying that we're in a post-racial world or anything like that. I totally understand that racism still exists. But I think what happens is we dilute the real racism when we appeal to everything being racist. You know, white people are racist. I was listening to Bell Hooks again yesterday, and she was talking about our son, our brother, Trayvon Martin. And I understand it's a tragedy. But she was asking the question, you know, was he naive to the nature of whiteness? That is an incredibly, incredibly racist statement. I just about fell off my chair when I heard that. I didn't even expect to hear that from Bell Hooks. That, to me, is race baiting, and it is incredibly racist.
Why do they have this history of violence and police brutality that has never been addressed?